A chilling warning from Iran, delivered not in words but in action-packed video. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has released close-up video of a U.S. aircraft carrier.
Iran has now deployed its first ever dedicated naval drone carrier, the Shahed Bageri, positioned near the strategic Strait of Hormuz.
Let me drop you right onto the deck level tension as it looked this week. By early January 28, 2026, the moment the US carrier strike group's presence was being framed publicly as a looming armada, the real friction point wasn't just missiles or speeches, it was the invisible chess match in the air. US drones and airborne sensors were doing what they always do around a high-value naval formation: wide area surveillance, pattern of life tracking, and persistent overwatch that lets a carrier see long before anyone sees it. Iran's answer wasn't to blink, it was to push its own unmanned picture outward, using UAVs as forward eyes and electronic tripwires. And that's where the confrontation starts to feel personal, because drones don't posture like ships. They intrude, they shadow, they test reaction times. You get these tight, high-risk moments where one side's unmanned platform drifts into the other side's claimed envelope, and suddenly everyone is watching for a snap decision, an intercept vector, a forced turnaway, a burst of electronic interference, the kind of thing that can look like nothing happened to the public and still feel like a hair-trigger incident inside an operations room. Now pan out one click, because the timeline matters. The carrier strike group led by the USS Abraham Lincoln was confirmed in the region on January 26th, and the political temperature spiked hard by January 28th. Trump's warnings about a nuclear deal and threats of a far worse next attack landed the same day Iranian officials publicly signaled they were ready to respond to any aggression. That's the backdrop for why both sides lean so heavily on drones right now. Drones let you probe and signal without immediately committing to manned escalation, and they let you build the targeting picture that decides everything in a Gulf crisis: who can track what, for how long, and how reliably under jamming and deception. You can feel the logic in the way Iranian figures talked on social media. The message wasn't "we're looking for a fight," it was "we're not going to be surprised." Here's the part most people miss. When a carrier strike group arrives, the aircraft carrier is the headline, but the real system is the web. Escorts, aircraft, satellites, tankers, command posts, and a surveillance bubble that stretches far beyond the horizon. Publicly, US Central Command described the deployment as promoting regional security and stability, and reporting around the movement stressed the group's ability to expand presidential options quickly. But operationally, Iran reads the same movement as a live-fire rehearsal for coercion, a way to hold strike capacity close enough to threaten, far enough to reduce risk, and loud enough to shape politics. That's why Iranian responses tend to mix military readiness language with a deterrence story, because in their view, the fastest way to prevent war is to convince Washington that the first hours would be messy, expensive, and unpredictable. And you know what's changed since the older Gulf standoffs? Unmanned systems are no longer a sideshow, they're the front edge of the encounter. Think about the types being discussed. On the US side, platforms like MQ-9 Reapers are built for persistence and strike-capable ISR, while high-altitude systems like the RQ-4 Global Hawk family and other strategic ISR aircraft represent the wide net that helps map maritime movement and cue other sensors. On Iran's side, you have a layered ecosystem, loitering munitions like the Shahed 136 family that are cheap enough to be used in volume, plus longer-range strike reconnaissance drones like the Mahajer 10 that Iranian media has described as having long endurance and a large payload for sensors and munitions. The point isn't that one drone beats another, it's that drones let each side keep contact without risking pilots, and that makes brinkmanship easier to sustain. But to really grasp why Tehran thinks the balance is shifting, you have to look at the sea-based piece, because Iran isn't only flying drones from land anymore. Iran has been building and showcasing forward-based ships and drone-capable vessels converted from commercial hulls, and the Revolutionary Guard has publicly leaned into this as deterrence by reach. The ability ability to operate drones and helicopters at sea away from fixed bases, complicating the geometry of surveillance and response. Reporting and analysis around these converted ships describe a large flat deck, facilities for rotary wing operations, and sensors like a phased array radar with detection ranges discussed out to around 200 kilometers. Exact names and performance claims vary across sources, but the strategic purpose is consistent: extend Iran's eyes and options beyond the coastline. Hang on, because this is where the confrontation over drones becomes more than a spy versus spy story. It becomes a targeting story. A carrier doesn't fear a drone in isolation. It fears a chain. Detection, tracking, classification, queuing, massed attack coordination. Iran's emphasis on UAV scale, mixed types and maritime adjacent launch options is designed to stress that chain, not necessarily to promise a clean knockout. It's the logic of asymmetric pressure. If you can force the US Navy to treat a large stream of low-cost objects as potential threats, you can increase the defensive burden, compress decision time, and raise the risk of mistakes. Even Western commentary around the current deployment has focused on the basic asymmetry, low-cost drones and saturation concepts challenging high-value naval assets without claiming this is simple or guaranteed. I was shocked when Iranian conservative cultural official and figure as Ghadi suggests that Iran's stealth drone capabilities could surprise Washington and Trump.
ما باید انشالله ترامپ رو اگر بشه یک مثل کاری که اینا با مادورو کردن ما یه همچی کاری باید با ترامپ بکنیم. یعنی خب پس طبق منطق همه کار میشه کرد و حالا این آدم پلید رو سگ زرد وحشی یا دو دوره ریاست جمهوریش یا اگر نشد بعدش حتما باید این تقاضا پس.
البته که امروز مقام معظم رهبری فرمودن مثل فرعون و نمرود در اوج غرور سرنگون خواهد شد.
اینو من خیلی دلم میخواد این رو بگیرنش، چون این جو آدمایی که در موضع قدرت اینقدر متفرعن و متکبرن وقتی گیر نیفتن مثل سگ زوزه میکشن. من این جو آدما رو میشناسم. این همین الان این ترامپ اگر بگیرن بازداشتش کنن و دو تا تو گوشش بزنن و بیارنش تو دادگاه مثل سگ زوزه میکشه.
Now, let me tell you what really poured fuel on yesterday. The rhetoric hardened into something that sounded less like crisis management and more like a warning label. Reuters reported Trump urging Iran to make a nuclear deal and warning the next attack will be far worse, explicitly tying it to prior US strikes and describing a US armada moving toward Iran. In parallel, senior Iranian figures signaled that any US military action would trigger retaliation against US and allied interests. Language meant to make escalation feel automatic, not discretionary. That pairing, an American threat framed as coercive leverage and an Iranian response framed as pre-committed defense, is exactly the kind of rhetorical lock-in that makes unmanned encounters more dangerous, because drones become the safe arena to demonstrate resolve while everyone's words make backing down harder. And you can see why Tehran would prefer to tell this as a deterrence success story rather than an aggression story. Iran has repeatedly framed new platforms, especially its drone carrier concepts and seagoing endurance, as a way to prevent war by making surprise impossible and by spreading out the tools of surveillance. In that framing, drones aren't just weapons, they're the method for denying an adversary the clean opening move. It's also why Iran's messaging often blends "we don't seek conflict" with "we won't bow to threats," because the whole point is to turn US pressure into a credibility test. If Washington wants to intimidate, Iran wants to show it can absorb the intimidation without losing control of the operational picture. Now let's talk about Netanyahu for a second, because even when this story is US-Iran, Israel is always in the room as a strategic shadow. Days ago, Netanyahu publicly warned Iran in a Knesset speech that any attempt by Iran to harm Israel would be met with a decisive response. The problem with this kind of language in a region already primed for miscalculation is that it nudges every actor toward worst-case assumptions. Iran hears an argument for preemption, and Washington hears a reason to keep the carrier posture tighten forward. And once everyone is performing toughness, drones become the easiest lever, because a drone incident can be used to justify a larger move without the admitting the larger move was political. As for the what if it all goes wrong scenario, people keep whispering. Regime change fantasies, a sudden invasion, a collapse of deterrence. Here's the sober version. If a major US-Iran conflict ever erupted, the first strategic shock wouldn't be a single dramatic strike. It would be the region-wide disruption cascade. Energy shipping risk spikes, insurance markets panic, Allied basing politics fracture, and Washington gets dragged into a long argument about why it's paying enormous costs for uncertain outcomes. Politically, presidents don't get judged on the first press conference. They get judged on the second-order effects: oil price shocks, strain on forces, and the public's tolerance for open-ended escalation. That's why, even in hawkish discourse, you often see the careful hedging. Threaten loudly, posture heavily, but keep doors open for de-escalation when the costs start looking real. So if you're trying to understand what the next few days feel like inside the region, imagine this: a carrier's surveillance bubble constantly scanning, Iranian UAVs constantly trying to map, message and probe, leaders trading threats that shrink their own room to maneuver, and millions of people, from Gulf ports to global markets, effectively hostage to whether a drone operator on one side or the other decides to turn away or decides to prove a point. That's the tension, not a Hollywood moment. A slow, technical, tightly wound contest where the smallest airborne encounter can suddenly become the biggest headline.